Have you ever known someone who does good things without telling anyone? Someone who helps quietly. Someone who never asks for attention. Someone who believes kindness should be silent. In many neighborhoods across America, there are people like that. People who never appear in newspapers. People who never stand on a stage to receive awards. But somehow, their small acts of kindness slowly shape the lives of everyone around them. This story begins in a quiet neighborhood called Willow Creek. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved when they passed each other, where children rode bicycles in the afternoon, where the same mailman delivered letters every morning at nearly the same time. Nothing about Willow Creek seemed unusual. Small houses, tree-lined streets, a park with two wooden benches and an old oak tree in the center. And in the middle of that neighborhood lived a woman named Margaret Lewis. Margaret was 62 years old. She lived alone in a small yellow house with a white wooden fence. If you walked past her house, you might notice the garden first. It was always carefully maintained, rows of small flowers, tomato plants growing quietly near the back fence, a narrow stone path leading to the front door. Margaret liked simple things. She woke up early every morning. She drank tea at the kitchen table while sunlight slowly filled the room. She read a few pages of a book before starting her day. Her life seemed peaceful, ordinary. Most neighbors would probably describe Margaret in the same way. Quiet, kind, always smiling. But few people truly knew how much Margaret had quietly done for the people around her, because for more than 20 years, Margaret had been helping her neighbors in ways that almost no one noticed. She never spoke about it. She never expected anyone to say thank you. To Margaret, and kindness was not something you announced. It was something you simply did. It started many years earlier, back when Margaret was in her early 40s. At that time, her husband David was still alive. They had moved into the yellow house together, hoping to build a peaceful life in Willow Creek. David worked as a mechanic. Margaret worked part-time at a small library in town. Their life was modest, but it was happy. Then one winter morning, everything changed. David had a sudden heart attack while working at the garage. The news came quickly, too quickly. Within a single afternoon, Margaret's life became something she had never imagined. Quiet, empty, lonely. For many months after David passed away, Margaret struggled to understand how to continue her life. The house felt too big. The nights felt too long. Even simple things like making dinner felt strangely difficult. When you spend many years sharing life with someone, silence can feel heavy. Margaret tried many things to fill the empty time. She read more books. She walked around the neighborhood in the evenings. She spent more time in her garden. But something inside her still felt unsettled, until one afternoon changed everything. It happened on a rainy Thursday. Margaret was walking home from the small grocery store 2 blocks away. As she passed the house on the corner, she noticed an elderly man struggling with 2 heavy bags. His name was Mr. Peterson. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone. Margaret had seen him many times before, but they had never spoken more than a simple hello. That day, without thinking too much, she walked over. "Would you like some help?" she asked gently. Mr. Peterson looked surprised, then relieved. "Yes," he said with a small laugh. "These bags seem heavier every year." Margaret carried one bag while he carried the other. They walked slowly to his front door. When they arrived, Mr. Peterson smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. "You saved me a lot of trouble today." Margaret smiled back. It was nothing. But as she walked home afterward, something inside her felt different. For the first time in many months, her thoughts were not focused on her own sadness. They were focused on someone else, and that simple moment changed something important. A few days later, Margaret noticed that the Peterson family newspaper had not been picked up from the front porch. It had rained during the night. The paper was getting wet, so Margaret quietly walked over, picked it up, and placed it safely near the door. No one saw her. No one knew. But the small act made her feel strangely peaceful. Soon, small moments like that began to happen more often. If a neighbor was traveling, Margaret watered their plants. If an elderly couple struggled with groceries, Margaret helped carry the bags. If someone's mailbox door broke, Margaret quietly fixed it with a small screwdriver. None of these things seemed important. They were just small acts, small moments, small kindnesses. But over time, those quiet actions slowly became part of Margaret's life. Day after day, year after year, 20 years passed in this quiet rhythm. And during all that time, Margaret never spoke about the things she did. To her, kindness was not a performance. It was simply the way she chose to live. But something unusual was about to happen in Willow Creek, because one day, the entire neighborhood was going to discover what Margaret had been quietly doing for them all these years. And when they finally realized the truth, they would see her in a completely different way. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up slowly. Sunlight moved across the quiet street. Birds sat on the electric wires above the houses. A dog barked somewhere far away. For most people, it felt like an ordinary morning. But for Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, it was the beginning of another day of quiet work that no one would ever notice. She woke up at 6 o'clock, just as she had done for many years. Her small kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast. The house was simple. The walls held a few old photographs. Her late husband smiling beside a fishing lake. Her daughter at 8 years old, holding a school trophy. A picture of Eleanor herself when she was much younger. She rarely looked at those pictures for long. Not because they made her sad, but because she believed the past should stay peaceful behind us. After finishing her coffee, she opened a small wooden drawer near the table. Inside the drawer was a notebook. It wasn't fancy. The cover was slightly worn. The corners were bent from years of use, but the pages inside were carefully organized. Names, addresses, small notes written beside each one. Mrs. Alvarez, arthritis getting worse. Tommy Reed, parents working nights. Mr. Carter, lost wife last winter. Eleanor looked at the list quietly. Then she added a new note. Mailbox broken. House on Maple Street. She closed the notebook and slipped it back into the drawer. To anyone else, the notebook would look ordinary. But it was the quiet map of everything she had been doing for 20 years. No one had ever seen it. And she hoped no one ever would, because helping people, in her mind, was not something you talked about. It was something you simply did. Outside, the street was beginning to move. Cars started their engines. Children waited for the school bus. Neighbors stepped outside with their morning coffee. Eleanor stepped onto her porch with the small paper bag in her hand. Inside the bag were 3 fresh sandwiches. She walked slowly down the sidewalk. Her steps were calm and unhurried. 2 blocks away lived Mrs. Alvarez. The old woman had once been full of energy. She used to garden every morning and laugh loudly with her friends. But arthritis had slowly made walking painful. Some days she struggled even to open jars or carry groceries. Eleanor reached the small blue house and gently placed the paper bag on the front step. She knocked once. Then she walked away before the door opened. She didn't want to be thanked. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Alvarez opened her door. She looked down and saw the bag. Inside were the sandwiches and a small handwritten note. Have a peaceful morning. No name, no explanation. Mrs. Alvarez smiled softly, because this was not the first time. In fact, she had stopped wondering who left the food a long time ago. Sometimes kindness arrives quietly, and maybe it's better not to ask too many questions. Across the street, a teenage boy named Tommy Reed was rushing out of his house. His backpack hung half open. His hair looked like he had just rolled out of bed, which, in truth, he had. His parents worked late night shifts at the hospital. Many mornings, Tommy had to get ready for school by himself. As he reached his bike, he noticed something on the seat, a small paper bag. Inside was a banana, a granola bar, and a bottle of juice. Tommy stared at it for a moment, then he smiled. Breakfast fairy again, he whispered. He didn't know who left it, but whoever it was had been doing it for nearly a year. He ate the banana as he rode towards school. At the corner of Oak Street, Eleanor was already halfway home. Her hands were empty now, but her quiet work had already touched 2 lives before most people had finished breakfast. She didn't count these moments. She didn't record them anywhere. Because kindness, she believed, should feel natural, not like something that needed recognition. When she returned home, she began her second small project of the day, fixing the broken mailbox on Maple Street. The house belonged to a young couple who had recently moved into the neighborhood. They worked long hours. The mailbox had been leaning sideways for nearly a week. Eleanor had noticed it during her evening walks, so the night before she had bought a few simple tools. Now she carried them in a small bag. When she reached the house, the street was empty. Perfect. She quietly straightened the wooden post, tightened the screws, adjusted the mailbox door. The entire job took less than 15 minutes. When she finished, she stepped back and nodded. Good enough. Then she walked away. No note this time, just a small problem quietly solved. Later that afternoon, the young couple returned home from work. The husband noticed the mailbox immediately. Hey, didn't this thing look broken yesterday? His wife looked closer. It did. They both looked around the street, but no one was outside. Maybe the city fixed it, he guessed. Maybe, she said. But somehow, it didn't feel like something the city would do. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat in her small living room with the book in her hands. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were resting. Outside her window, the neighborhood continued its normal rhythm. People going to work, children returning from school, neighbors mowing their lawns. And none of them noticed the quiet thread connecting many small acts of kindness around them. They didn't know someone had been watching their struggles, their lonely days, their difficult moments, and quietly helping when they needed it most. Eleanor didn't feel special. In fact, she often believed she was simply doing what anyone should do. Years earlier, after her husband passed away, the house had felt unbearably quiet. Grief can make the world feel very small, very empty. During that time, she began taking slow walks around the neighborhood just to clear her mind. And during those walks, she started noticing things. The elderly man who struggled to carry groceries, the single mother who always looked exhausted, the boy who waited for the school bus without breakfast. She realized something simple. Everyone was carrying something heavy, not always visible, but always real. And sometimes the smallest act could make that weight a little lighter. So she started helping, one small thing at a time, one person at a time, without introducing herself, without explaining, because she believed kindness should feel like sunlight, quiet, natural, and warm. For 20 years, she continued this simple routine: a repaired fence, a bag of groceries, a handwritten note, a cleared sidewalk after snow, a small birthday cake left anonymously on a lonely porch. The neighborhood slowly became a kinder place, but no one knew exactly why. And they simply believed they were lucky to live among good people. That afternoon, Eleanor closed her book and stood up slowly. There was one more thing to do before evening. She opened the wooden drawer again and took out the notebook. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at a name near the bottom: Mr. Carter. She sighed gently. Mr. Carter had lost his wife the previous winter. Since then, his house had stayed quiet, too quiet. Tonight, she decided he shouldn't eat dinner alone. She took a clean container from the cupboard and began preparing something simple: chicken soup, the kind that warms a house with its smell, the kind that feels like comfort. The sun was beginning to set when she finished cooking. She placed the container into another paper bag, then added a small note: warm food for a cool evening. Again, no name, just kindness. But this time, something different was about to happen, because across the street, and someone had started noticing a pattern: a curious neighbor who had begun asking quiet questions, and before long, the invisible kindness of 20 years would slowly begin to reveal itself. That evening, the sky above Willow Creek slowly turned soft shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood was calm. A few porch lights began to glow. The smell of dinner floated gently through the quiet streets. Margaret placed the warm container of chicken soup into a small paper bag. She folded the top carefully. Then she wrote a short note in her slow, neat handwriting: warm food for a cool evening. She paused for a moment, looking at the note. No name, just like always. She slipped the note inside the bag, put on her light jacket, and stepped outside. The air was cool but comfortable. Margaret walked slowly down the sidewalk toward Mr. Carter's house. It was only 3 houses away, but she still moved quietly, just as she had done for many years. The house looked darker than the others. Only a single lamp glowed through the living room window. Mr. Carter had lost his wife the previous winter. Since then, the house seemed to have lost its warmth. Margaret had noticed small signs of loneliness during her evening walks. The curtains rarely opened. The garden had slowly become overgrown. Sometimes Mr. Carter sat alone on the porch for long periods without speaking to anyone. Margaret reached the front steps. She placed the paper bag gently near the door. Then she knocked once, just once, and turned to leave, exactly as she always did. But this time, something unexpected happened. The door opened sooner than she expected. "Hello?" a quiet voice said. Margaret froze for a brief moment. For 20 years, she had carefully avoided being seen. But now, standing only a few steps away, she slowly turned around. Mr. Carter stood in the doorway. He looked surprised, then confused, and then something else: recognition. "Oh," he said softly. Margaret offered a small smile. "Good evening." Mr. Carter looked down at the bag, then back at her. You brought this?" Margaret hesitated for a moment. She had never needed to explain before, but now there was no point pretending. "Yes," she said gently. Mr. Carter opened the bag and looked inside. The smell of the soup drifted into the cool evening air. His eyes softened. "That's very kind of you," he said. Margaret nodded politely. "It's nothing special." But Mr. Carter studied her face more closely. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "Are you the one who cleared my driveway after the snowstorm last winter?" Margaret blinked slightly. "I suppose I did." Mr. Carter looked even more curious. And the tomatoes that appeared on my porch last summer? Margaret smiled faintly. They were from my garden. Mr. Carter leaned gently against the doorframe. A slow realization was beginning to form. For months, he said quietly, I thought some mysterious neighbor was helping me. Margaret laughed softly. Well, it seems you found the mysterious neighbor. For a moment, they both stood there in the warm glow of the porch light. Then Mr. Carter said something unexpected. Would you like to come inside for a few minutes? Margaret almost refused, not because she didn't want to be polite, but because she had always kept a quiet distance from the people she helped. It made the kindness simpler, cleaner, but something in Mr. Carter's voice felt sincere, so she nodded, just for a moment. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. Mr. Carter placed the soup carefully on the kitchen counter. Please sit, he said. Margaret sat at the small kitchen table. It had been a long time since she had visited someone's home in the neighborhood. Mr. Carter poured 2 cups of tea. As he placed one in front of her, he shook his head slightly. I can't believe it was you all this time. Margaret shrugged gently. I was only trying to help. But you've helped many people, Mr. Carter said slowly. How do you know? Margaret asked. He smiled. People talk. Margaret looked surprised. For years, strange little things kept happening around this neighborhood. A broken fence repaired overnight. Groceries appearing on someone's porch. A sidewalk cleared after snow. A birthday cake left for a lonely widow. He leaned back in his chair. We always wondered who was doing these things. Margaret felt a small warmth in her chest, but also a little discomfort. She had never wanted the attention. I hope no one was bothered, she said quietly. Bothered? Mister? And Carter laughed softly. Margaret, those small acts kept many people going during difficult times. She looked down at her tea. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Carter said something that made her look up again. You know, he said, someone else noticed something recently. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Oh, who? The young couple on Maple Street. They were talking yesterday about how their broken mailbox mysteriously fixed itself. Margaret felt a quiet smile forming, but Mr. Carter continued. And Mrs. Alvarez mentioned the sandwiches she sometimes finds on her doorstep. And that boy, Tommy Reed. He told the school bus driver about the mystery breakfasts. Margaret slowly understood what he was saying. For years, her kindness had been invisible, but now, people were beginning to connect the small pieces, the quiet acts, the unexplained help, the invisible thread of kindness running through Willow Creek. Mr. Carter looked at her thoughtfully. I don't think it will stay a secret much longer. Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions, embarrassment, surprise, and something else. A quiet hope, because she had never done these things to be known. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was something beautiful about people discovering kindness together. Outside, the porch light flickered gently in the evening breeze. And somewhere in the neighborhood, another neighbor was beginning to notice something unusual too. A pattern, a story hidden inside 20 years of quiet generosity. And soon, the entire neighborhood would finally understand who had been quietly caring for them all this time. The next morning in Willow Creek felt slightly different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just curious. Small conversations had begun to appear in unexpected places. at the bus stop, near the mailboxes, inside the small grocery store on the corner. People were beginning to talk about the same strange question: who had been quietly helping everyone for all these years? It started with simple observations. Mrs. and Alvarez told the cashier about the sandwiches that sometimes appeared on her porch. Tommy Reed mentioned the mysterious breakfast bags he often found on his bicycle. The young couple on Maple Street spoke about their repaired mailbox, and Mr. Carter, who normally spoke very little to anyone, quietly shared something important. "I think I know who it is." But he did not say the name right away. He only smiled and said, "You'll understand soon." Meanwhile, Margaret woke up that morning exactly the same way she always did. 6 o'clock, soft sunlight through the kitchen window, a warm cup of tea. For a moment, she wondered if the quiet rhythm of her life might change now. If people truly discovered what she'd been doing, perhaps things would feel different. But Margaret pushed the thought away. She had never helped others for recognition, so she decided to continue her day as usual. After breakfast, as she opened the small wooden drawer beside the kitchen table, inside was the familiar notebook, the quiet record of 20 years of kindness. She slowly flipped through the pages. Some names had been crossed out over the years: neighbors who had moved away, neighbors who had passed on. Life changes quietly in neighborhoods, but many names remained. And beside each name were small notes, simple reminders of who might need help. Margaret studied one page for a moment, and then she closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Today, she thought, would simply be another ordinary day. But outside her house, something unusual was already happening. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez was speaking with the young couple from Maple Street. Tommy Reed stood nearby with his backpack. Mr. Carter slowly walked toward them from the sidewalk. It was rare to see so many neighbors talking together in the morning. Usually everyone rushed to work or school. But today, curiosity had slowed them down. "Mr. Carter," Mrs. Alvarez asked gently, "you said yesterday you might know who's been helping everyone." Mr. Carter nodded quietly. "I think I do." The young couple leaned closer. Tommy adjusted his backpack straps. "Well," the husband asked. Mr. Carter looked down the street at the small yellow house with the white fence, Margaret's house. "She lives right there," he said softly. Everyone turned their heads at the same time. For a moment, no one spoke. "That quiet lady?" the wife whispered. "The one with the garden?" Tommy blinked. "You mean Mrs. Lewis?" Mrs. Alvarez looked thoughtful. "She does smile at everyone." Mr. Carter nodded. "Yesterday evening she brought me soup, and we talked for a while." What she didn't realize, he continued slowly, is that many of the things she described sounded exactly like the kindness people in this neighborhood have been receiving for years. The group stood silently for a moment. Then Tommy spoke first. "So, you think she's the one?" Mr. Carter smiled. "I'm almost certain." The young couple exchanged surprised looks. "That means," the wife said slowly, "all those things, the groceries, the repairs, the snow clearing, the birthday cakes." Mrs. Alvarez placed her hand gently over her heart. All these years, and she never said a word. At that exact moment, Margaret stepped outside her front door. She carried a small watering can for her garden. She noticed the group of neighbors standing together down the street. For a brief moment, she wondered what they were discussing. Then she simply waved politely, just as she always did. The neighbors waved back, but this time their smiles were different, warmer, full of quiet understanding. Margaret returned her attention to the flowers. She watered the small red roses beside the fence. She had planted them nearly 10 years earlier. Gardening always calmed her mind. But as she worked, she noticed something unusual. Neighbors were passing by her house more slowly than usual. Some smiled, some nodded with deeper gratitude than before. One neighbor even stopped and said something unexpected. "Good morning, Margaret. Thank you for everything you do." Margaret looked up, confused. "You're welcome," she replied automatically. But inside her mind, a small question began to grow. Had people discovered her secret? Across the street, Mr. Carter and the others continued their quiet discussion. "What should we do?" the young husband asked. Mr. Carter thought for a moment. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "She never wanted attention." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. That's true. But maybe," Tommy suggested, "we could still thank her somehow." The group slowly began to form an idea. Something simple, something gentle, something that would honor the spirit of the kindness Margaret had shown for 20 years. They didn't need a big event. They didn't need speeches. They only needed something that would show her one important truth. Her quiet kindness had not gone unnoticed. It had quietly changed the entire neighborhood. And later that evening, Willow Creek would do something it had never done before. Something small, something beautiful, something that would finally show Margaret Lewis that 20 years of quiet kindness had touched far more hearts than she ever imagined. That evening, the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees of Willow Creek. The sky turned soft shades of gold and blue. Lights began turning on inside the small houses along the street. For Margaret, it felt like any other evening. She finished watering her garden. She cleaned the kitchen after a simple dinner. Then she sat quietly in her living room with the book resting on her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her mind kept returning to the strange moment earlier that morning. The neighbors standing together, the unusual smiles, and the words she had heard from the man walking his dog. "Thank you for everything you do." Margaret had not asked what he meant. She simply nodded and continued watering her flowers. But the feeling stayed with her all day. Outside, something unusual was slowly unfolding across the neighborhood. Small porch lights flickered on one by one. But tonight, those lights were not the only thing appearing. At the end of Margaret Street, Mrs. Alvarez stepped outside her house holding a small candle inside a glass jar. Across from her, the young couple from Maple Street carried two more candles. Tommy Reed arrived on his bicycle with 3 jars in his backpack. "Mr." Carter walked slowly toward them, holding one final candle. None of them spoke loudly. They didn't want to make a spectacle. The plan they had created earlier was simple, quiet, just like the kindness they wanted to honor. One by one, they began placing the candles along the sidewalk in front of Margaret's house. Each jar rested gently on the ground, small, warm lights forming a peaceful line beside the white wooden fence. Soon, more neighbors quietly joined them. A woman who had once received groceries during a difficult winter. A man whose broken fence had mysteriously been repaired years earlier. A mother whose child had once found a birthday cake on their porch when money had been tight. No one announced the gathering, yet somehow, word had quietly spread through Willow Creek. People brought candles, small handwritten notes, simple flowers from their gardens. Each person added something small to the growing display. Inside her house, Margaret noticed the glow first, soft light flickering through the curtains. She stood slowly and walked to the front window. At first, she thought perhaps children were playing outside with flashlights. But when she opened the front door, She stopped in surprise. The entire sidewalk in front of her house was glowing with gentle candlelight, dozens of small jars, each one flickering softly in the evening air. And standing quietly behind them were her neighbors. Margaret looked from face to face. Mrs. Alvarez smiled warmly. Tommy raised his hand in a small wave. The young couple from Maple Street stood side by side. Mr. Carter stepped forward slowly. For a moment, Margaret didn't know what to say. "What is all this?" she asked softly. Mr. Carter smiled. "A thank you." Margaret blinked in confusion. "For what?" Mrs. Alvarez stepped closer. "For 20 years of kindness." Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly. You, you know? Tommy laughed gently. "We figured it out." The young woman from Maple Street nodded. "All the little things you've done. The food, the repairs, the notes, the help." Margaret looked down at the glowing candles. She suddenly felt embarrassed. "Oh my," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to notice." The neighbors smiled at those words. Mr. Carter spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "That's exactly why we wanted to do this quietly. No speeches, no big celebration. Just a small moment to tell you something important." Margaret looked up again. "What's that?" Mrs. Alvarez placed her hand gently on Margaret's arm. "Kindness spreads. For years, we thought these good things were just random. But slowly, we realized something else." Margaret listened quietly. The young husband from Maple Street continued the thought. "When people receive kindness, they often pass it on." Tommy nodded. "I helped a new kid at school last year because someone helped me first." Mrs. Alvarez smiled. "I started cooking extra soup for my sister's neighbor when she was sick." Mr. Carter looked around the street. "This neighborhood became kinder because of you." Margaret's eyes slowly filled with emotion. She had never imagined that her quiet actions could travel so far. For 20 years, she believed she was only helping one person at a time. But now she understood something deeper. Kindness moves like gentle waves. One small act touches another life, and that life touches another, until the quiet goodness spreads further than anyone can see. Margaret looked again at the candles glowing along her sidewalk. Each light represented someone she had tried to help, but tonight those same people were giving something back: gratitude, connection, community. She placed her hand over her heart and spoke softly. "I never did these things to be noticed." The young woman from Maple Street smiled. "We know. That's why it matters so much." The evening air grew calm and peaceful. No one rushed away. Neighbors stood together, talking quietly. Some laughed. Some shared stories about the small kindnesses they had received over the years. For the first time in a long time, Margaret did not feel like a quiet observer of the neighborhood. She felt like part of its living heart. Later that night, after everyone returned home, the candles slowly burned down, one by one. Margaret stepped outside again before going to bed. A few jars still flickered softly in the dark. She stood beside the fence and looked down the peaceful street. The same street she had walked for 20 years. The same neighbors she had quietly tried to help. But tonight something felt different. The kindness she had given to others had come back to her in the most beautiful way. Not through praise, not through attention, but through a simple reminder. Even the quietest acts of goodness can leave a lasting light in the world. And sometimes, that light shines brightest when we least expect it. Thank you for listening to this gentle story. If this quiet moment brought you peace, reflection, or inspiration, Consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness still exists in everyday life. And remember, sometimes the most powerful kindness is the one done quietly, when no one is watching.